Sometimes the things others throw away hold more value than anything money can buy. Sometimes a broken thing is exactly what's needed to mend a broken heart. When Tilda Rane paid silver for a wagon so damaged its axle touched dirt, every man in Ridge Hollow laughed. Mountain woman, they called her, the quiet soul who kept to herself. But they didn't know what the winter had taught her. Eban Croft, the town blacksmith, was the only one who didn't laugh. He'd buried enough dreams to recognize purpose. Night after night, Tilda worked by lantern light. The wagon began to change. What she was building wasn't meant for travel or trade. What could one woman need with a wagon that would never roll again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ridge Hollow sat in a valley between two mountain ranges in the Wyoming territory, where the wind carried the scent of pine and the promises men made to themselves about starting fresh. It was 1887, and the town had been there long enough to have a proper main street, a church with a steeple that needed paint, and the kind of history that people preferred not to talk about over Sunday dinner. The town had grown around the mining operations that dotted the hills like forgotten prayers. When the silver played out, most folks moved on, but some stayed. The ones who remained were the sort who'd put down roots too deep to pull up, or who had nowhere else to go, or who'd buried something here they couldn't leave behind. Tilda Rane fell into that last category. Though she'd never say so out loud, she lived in a cabin up in the high country, a day's ride from town when the weather was fair. Folks only saw her when she came down to trade. Pelts and herbs mostly, things the mountain gave to those who knew how to ask. She'd appear on market days, like a shadow that had learned to walk, set up her wares without fuss, conduct her business with nods and simple words, then disappear back up the trail before sunset. They called her Mountain Woman, though she'd had a proper name once. Had a proper life too. 5 years back, she'd been Tilda Rane, wife to James Rane, mother to little Lily, who had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. They'd had a small ranch at the valley's edge, nothing grand but enough. James worked hard, Lily laughed often, and Tilda had believed the worst of her troubles were behind her. Then the fever came. It took Lily first. She was 4 years old, and the fever burned through her like wildfire through summer grass. Tilda tried everything, every herb, every poultice, every prayer she knew. The doctor came from town, but he had no answers either, just sad eyes and a bill they could barely pay. Lily died on a Tuesday morning, while her father held her and her mother sang the lullaby that had always soothed her to sleep. James lasted 6 months after that. The grief got into him deeper than any sickness. He stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, stopped seeing the point in dawn breaking or seasons turning. One morning in late autumn, Tilda found him in the barn. He'd hanged himself from the same beam where he'd taught Lily to toss hay to the horses. The ranch went to pay debts. Tilda took what she could carry and walked up into the mountains. That was 5 years ago, and she'd been Mountain Woman ever since. But this past winter had been different. She'd spent it in a line shack up in the high pass, so remote that even the wolves gave it a wide berth. The snow came early and stayed late, and there were weeks when Tilda saw nothing but white in every direction. She'd prepared well enough, had food, fuel, water from the creek when she could break through the ice. What she hadn't prepared for was the silence. It wasn't the quiet that bothered her. She'd grown comfortable with that. It was the silence inside her own head, the way the grief that had been howling for 5 years suddenly went still. In that stillness, she could finally hear herself think, could finally ask the questions she'd been too busy surviving to consider. What was the point of staying alive if she wasn't really living? What was the point of breathing if every breath was just another moment of forgetting? And if she was going to keep forgetting, what exactly was she forgetting? The pain or Lily herself? By the time spring broke and the snow began to melt, Tilda had reached a decision. She couldn't bring them back, couldn't undo what had been done, but she could stop running from their memory, could stop treating grief like an enemy to be defeated instead of a companion to be understood. She came down from the mountain in early April with something different in her step. The townspeople noticed, but couldn't quite name what had changed. She still kept to herself, still conducted her business with few words. But there was a steadiness to her now, a resolve that made people step aside when she walked past. Eban Croft noticed most of all. He ran the smithy on the east end of town, where the main street gave way to scattered homes and eventually open prairie. The forge had been there since Ridge Hollow's beginning, and Eban had taken it over from the previous smith who died without children to pass it to. That had been 12 years ago, and Eban had been shoeing horses and mending wagon wheels ever since. He was a man built for hard work, broad shoulders, thick forearms, hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same iron he shaped. His hair had gone mostly grey, though he was only 43, and he had the kind of face that made people trust him without knowing why. Maybe it was the eyes. They were honest eyes, the kind that had seen enough trouble to recognize it in others and enough sorrow to offer comfort. Without words, Eban had his own ghosts. He'd come west after the war, between the states that had torn the country in half and left men like him with memories they couldn't outrun. He'd been a soldier, though he never talked about which side or which battles. What mattered was that he'd survived when many hadn't, and survival came with its own weight. After the war, he'd married a woman named Anne. She'd been the daughter of a general store owner in Missouri, and she'd seen something in the quiet blacksmith that made her say yes when he asked. They'd come west together, chasing the same dream of starting fresh that brought most people to the territories. Anne got pregnant in their second year in Ridge Hollow. Eban had been happy for the first time since before the war. He'd started building a cradle in the evenings, working the wood with the same patience he used at the forge. He'd imagined teaching the child, boy or girl didn't matter, how to work with their hands, how to make something useful from raw material. Anne died in childbirth. The baby, a boy, died with her. The doctor said sometimes these things just happened, that there was no one to blame. But Eban blamed himself anyway. Should have gotten her to a better doctor. Should have been able to do something. Should have been stronger somehow. He'd lived alone ever since. Never remarried, never courted, never even entertained the idea. He worked the forge, kept to himself, and found what peace he could in the rhythm of hammer on metal and the satisfaction of making broken things work again. When he saw Tilda Rane walk down Main Street that April afternoon and stop in front of Mercer's livery, something in her posture caught his attention. He'd been outside the smithy, taking a moment to rest his back, when he noticed the small crowd gathering. Mercer had a wagon for sale, except it wasn't for sale so much as it was taking up space. The thing had been in an accident a few years back, and whoever owned it had abandoned it behind the livery. The axle was cracked, one wheel was missing entirely. The bed was split down the middle, and the tongue was bent at an angle that made the whole structure list to one side like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. It was, by any reasonable measure, firewood waiting to happen. Tilda stood in front of it for a long moment, her worn leather medicine pouch hanging from her shoulder, her face unreadable. Then she walked into the livery office. The men outside started laughing before she even came back out. Word spread quick. Mountain Woman was buying the broken wagon. The men who worked at the livery were practically falling over themselves with amusement. When Tilda emerged and counted out silver coins into Mercer's palm, the laughter got louder. "You fixin' to haul ghosts, Mountain Woman?" One of them called out. "That thing won't make it to the end of the street." Another one slapped his knee. "Maybe she's going to live in it. Set up house right where it sits." Tilda didn't respond. She never did. She just slung her blanket roll across her shoulder, walked over to the wagon, and began examining it closely. Her fingers traced the broken wood, tested the remaining wheels, measured the damage with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. Eban watched from across the street. He didn't laugh. He'd seen that look before, the look of someone who'd found purpose where others saw only ruin. He'd worn that look himself once, when he'd taken over the smithy that everyone said was too far gone to save. The sun was setting by the time the crowd dispersed, still chuckling and shaking their heads. Tilda remained by the wagon, working in the fading light. She'd already started removing the worst of the splintered wood, stacking it in neat piles, sorting what could be saved from what needed to be replaced entirely. Eban closed up the smithy and walked over. He stood a respectful distance away, hands in his pockets, waiting for her to acknowledge him. When she finally looked up, her eyes were calm, but guarded. "That's a lot of work you're taking on," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, axles cracked clean through. "Wheels not just missing, the hub's damaged too. You'll need metalwork." "I know," he nodded slowly. "What are you building?" It was a simple question, asked without judgment or mockery. Tilda studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he could be trusted with an honest answer. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she turned back to the wagon. "Something that needs to exist," she said. Eban understood that answer better than most would. He'd spent 12 years making things that needed to exist, horseshoes and barrel hoops and hinges that held doors steady. Small things, practical things, but things that mattered because they served a purpose. "If you need metalwork," he said, "smithy's open." "I'll pay fair," Tilda replied. "I expect you would." He walked back to the smithy, and Tilda returned to her work. Neither of them knew it yet, but something had shifted in that brief exchange. Two people who'd spent years keeping the world at arm's length had taken a step toward each other, drawn together by the recognition that sometimes broken things were worth saving. As darkness fell over Ridge Hollow, a single lantern burned beside the broken wagon, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Tilda worked on, her hammer tapping steadily, a rhythm like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been still too long. In his forge, Eban stoked the fire and began sketching plans for a new axle. He didn't question why he was doing it or what the mountain woman might need it for. He just knew that for the first time in 12 years, he had a reason to care about work that went beyond simple survival. The town slept that night, with no idea that everything was about to change. They'd laughed at the woman who bought a broken wagon, never imagining that she was buying something far more precious, a chance to turn grief into grace, and loneliness into something that looked surprisingly like hope. The next morning arrived cool and clear, the kind of spring day that made promises about summer it couldn't keep. Tilda was back at the wagon before most of Ridge Hollow had finished their breakfast, working with the methodical patience of someone who understood that good work couldn't be rushed. She'd spent the night at the boarding house, Mrs. Pemberton's place on Cedar Street, where travelers and the occasional widow took rooms by the week. Mrs. Pemberton had given her an appraising look when she'd come in, but had said nothing beyond what the rate was and where to find clean towels. Small mercies. Now in the morning light, Tilda could see the full extent of the damage. The wagon bed needed to be completely rebuilt. The sideboards were weathered beyond saving, split and warped from years of exposure. As she began prying loose the first board, something fell from behind it and landed in the dirt with a soft thump. She bent down and picked it up, brushing away the dust. It was a wooden horse, small enough to fit in a child's palm, carved with careful detail. The mane, the legs, even tiny hooves. The wood had darkened with age and handling, and one ear was chipped, but it was still clearly the work of someone who'd taken their time, who'd cared about getting it right. Tilda's hand closed around it, and something cold settled in her chest. She knew this toy. Not this specific one, but she knew what it meant. Every mother knew. It was the kind of thing a father made for a child during long winter evenings. The kind of thing that got carried everywhere, tucked into pockets, clutched during scary moments, held close during sleep. The kind of thing that should have been buried with the child who loved it. She stood there for a long moment. The wooden horse pressed against her palm, feeling the weight of a story she didn't yet know, but could already sense. Then she carefully wrapped it in her handkerchief and tucked it into her medicine pouch before continuing her work. By midday, she'd removed enough of the wagon's structure to reach the bed itself, and that was when she found the stain. It had soaked deep into the wood, dark and permanent. Blood, probably, though old enough that it might have been anything. But Tilda had seen enough blood in her life to recognize its ghost. She sat back on her heels, looking at that stain, and felt the pieces starting to come together in her mind. This wasn't just an old wagon that had fallen into disrepair. This was a wagon that had seen tragedy. Real tragedy, the kind that left marks nothing could wash away. She needed to know. Mercer's livery was quiet when she walked in. The owner, a heavy-set man named Tom Mercer, who'd run the place for 20 years, looked up from his ledger with surprise. Mountain Woman didn't usually make conversation. "That wagon," Tilda said without preamble. "Who did it belong to?" Mercer's face shifted, and something like discomfort crossed it. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I own it now. And it's carrying a story that ought to be told." He was quiet for a moment, then closed his ledger with a sigh. "Morrison family. Good people. Or they were anyway. What happened? 3 years back, maybe a bit more. They were heading east, going back to family in Ohio. Had 2 young ones, a boy about 7 and a girl maybe 5. Wagon hit a washout on the ridge road during a storm. Whole thing went over the side." Tilda's throat tightened. "The children." "Both of them." "Parents survived. Father broke his back. He can't work anymore. Mother hasn't spoken a word since. They live over on the far side of town now, in that little house behind the church. Town takes care of them best we can. What happened to the wagon?" "Sheriff pulled it up after the storm passed. It was too damaged to sell, so it's been sitting here ever since. Nobody wanted it. Too many bad memories." He paused. "That's why it was so cheap, Miss Rane. I'm sorry if you didn't know." "I know now," Tilda said quietly. She walked out into the afternoon sun, but the warmth didn't reach her. She stood in the middle of Main Street, people moving around her like water around a stone, and felt the full weight of what she'd taken on. This wagon had carried children to their deaths, had been there in their final moments. The toy horse had probably been the boy's, clutched in his hand or fallen from his pocket as everything went wrong. And now it had been abandoned, forgotten, left to rot behind a livery as if pretending it didn't exist would somehow undo what had happened. She understood that impulse. God, how she understood it. Hadn't she done the same thing? Run to the mountains, tried to forget, tried to pretend that if she didn't look at the pain, it would somehow disappear. But it didn't work that way. It never worked that way. Grief didn't fade from being ignored. It just went underground, poisoning everything from below, while you pretended the surface looked fine. The Morrison family was living proof of that. A father broken in body, a mother broken in spirit, and a town that had buried the memory along with the children because nobody knew what else to do. Tilda walked back to the wagon with new eyes. She stood there looking at it, really looking, and understood for the first time what she was meant to do. This wasn't about fixing an old wagon. It wasn't even about her own grief, though that was part of it. This was about making a place for all the grief that had nowhere to go, about taking something that represented death and transforming it into something that honored life. But remembering, not forgetting, because the people we've lost deserve better than to be erased by our discomfort. She was so deep in thought that she didn't hear Eban approach until he spoke. "Found something," he said quietly. She turned. He was standing a few feet away, holding the wooden horse. It must have fallen from her pouch when she'd been working. "I carved this," he said, his voice rough.
4 years ago.
"For Tommy Morrison. He was 7 years old, and he loved horses more than just about anything." Their eyes met, and in that moment they both understood. This wasn't coincidence. This was the kind of thing that happened when pain was ready to become purpose, when grief was ready to become grace. "I'm going to build a memorial," Tilda said. "Not just for my daughter. For all the children this town has lost. For Tommy and his sister. For your son. For everyone who died too soon and deserves to be remembered." Eban looked at the wagon, then back at her, and something in his expression shifted. The wall he'd built around himself, the same wall Tilda had built around herself, began to crack. "The town won't like it," he said. "I know. They'll say you're bringing up painful memories, that it's better to let the past stay buried." "They're wrong," I know they are. He held out the wooden horse. But you'll need help. This kind of work, it's too much for one person. She took the horse, cradling it carefully. Why would you help? Because I've spent 12 years trying to forget, Eban said. And I'm tired of it. Because that boy deserved better than to have his favorite toy lost and forgotten. Because maybe if we remember them right, it won't hurt so much to breathe. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. Two people who'd spent years running from their grief stood facing each other across a broken wagon and made a decision that would change everything. They would build something that the town didn't know it needed. Something that would force people to look at what they'd buried and name what they'd lost. It would be difficult and painful and necessary, and it would start with a wooden horse and a woman who knew that sometimes the only way to heal was to remember. Tomorrow, Tilda said. We start tomorrow. Eban nodded once, then turned and walked back to his smithy. Tilda returned to her work, but everything was different now. It was the first step on a journey that would teach Ridge Hollow what it meant to grieve together, to remember together, and maybe, just maybe, to heal together. The town didn't know it yet, but Mountain Woman was about to become something more. She was about to become the person who would help them face what they'd been running from, who would give their grief a home, who would prove that broken things and broken people were still worth saving. All it took was a forgotten wagon and the courage to care. Dawn came to Ridge Hollow with the kind of quiet that made promises. Tilda was at the wagon before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, her tools laid out in careful order, her mind clear about what needed to be done first. She'd spent the night thinking about structure, about foundation, about how to take something destroyed and make it into something that could carry weight again. Not physical weight, but the weight of memory. The first step was dismantling what remained. She worked slowly, treating each piece with respect even as she set it aside. This wood had carried children, had been part of their last moments. It deserved reverence, not rough handling. She was 2 hours into the work when Eban arrived. He didn't say anything, just set down his toolbox and a heavy forge hammer, the kind passed down through generations, its handle worn smooth by his father's hands and his grandfather's before that. He studied the wagon for a moment, then began working on the opposite side, his movements economical and sure. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour. There was comfort in it, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. Two people who understood that some work was sacred, that some silences said more than words ever could. When they finally paused for water, Tilda spoke first. The axle's the foundation. If that's not right, nothing else matters. Already started on it, Eban replied. Should have something ready by tomorrow. But the metalwork, the brackets, the wheel hubs, that'll take time to do properly. I'm not in a hurry. He nodded, understanding that rushing would dishonor what they were building. What about the wood? You'll need good lumber. Fresh lumber. I'll pay for it. That's not what I meant. He set down his water dipper. This is going to cost more than you think. Not just money, though there's that too. The town's already talking. Let them talk. They're saying you've gone strange. That grief's addled your mind. Mrs. Pemberton asked me this morning what in God's name we were doing out here. What did you tell her? That it was none of her concern. He picked up his hammer, testing its weight in his hand. But she's not wrong to ask. People are going to want answers, Tilda. They're going to want to know why we're rebuilding a wagon that killed 2 children. Then we'll tell them. When we're ready. Eban studied her face, seeing the determination there, the quiet strength that came from someone who'd already lost everything and discovered they could survive it. You know it won't be easy. This town, they've learned to cope by forgetting, by putting painful things away and pretending they don't exist. What you're proposing, making a place specifically for that pain, it's going to frighten people. Good, Tilda said. Fear means they're paying attention. Means they're feeling something besides numbness. She was right, and Eban knew it. He'd seen how Ridge Hollow dealt with tragedy, the way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned, the way people crossed the street to avoid the Morrison house, the way grief was treated like a sickness that might be contagious if you got too close. He'd participated in it himself. How many times had he avoided the cemetery where Anne and his son were buried? How many times had he worked late into the night just to avoid going home to an empty house that echoed with absence? Forgetting wasn't working. It had never worked. "I'll help," he said. "Whatever you need, however long it takes." Something passed between them then. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. Two souls who'd been lost, finding something like direction in each other's company. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Deputy Samuel rode by twice, slowing his horse to watch them work, his young face puzzled but not unkind. Several townspeople stopped to stare, some muttering to each other, others just shaking their heads before moving on. Around 3 o'clock, the sky darkened. Spring storms in Wyoming came fast and hard, and this one was no exception. The first drops fell heavy and cold, and within minutes it was a downpour. "Smithy," Eban called over the rain. "Come on." But Tilda didn't move. She stood there in the rain, her hands on the wagon's frame, water streaming down her face. Eban was about to call out again when he saw her shoulders shake. She was crying, he realized. Silent tears mixing with the rain, her body finally letting go of something she'd been holding too tightly for too long. He walked back to her, rain soaking through his shirt, and stood beside her without speaking. Sometimes the best thing you could offer another person was simple presence. Sometimes being alone was the worst thing in the world. And company, even silent company, was everything. They stood there together as the storm raged around them. Two people letting the rain wash away layers of old pain, making room for something new to grow. When the storm finally passed, leaving the world clean and dripping, Tilda turned to him. "I almost gave up just then," she admitted. "Stood here thinking about how impossible this all is. How maybe everyone's right and I should just let it go. Find some other way to—" She stopped, shaking her head. "But then I remembered something. The morning Lily died, after James carried her away and the doctor left, I sat in her room surrounded by her things. Her doll, her little dresses, the picture book I'd read to her every night. And I thought about packing it all away, hiding it in the attic where I wouldn't have to see it anymore." "Did you?" "No, I couldn't, because those things were all I had left of her. Putting them away felt like losing her twice." She looked at the wagon. "This town has packed away its grief like old clothes in an attic. Tommy Morrison's parents can't speak about their children. Your son doesn't have a place where people remember his name. My Lily is just that sad thing that happened to Mountain Woman. What are you proposing? A place where grief doesn't have to be hidden, where people can say the names of those they've lost, without everyone getting uncomfortable and changing the subject. Where children who died too soon aren't forgotten just because remembering hurts." Eban looked at the wagon with new understanding. It wouldn't be just a memorial. It would be permission. Permission to grieve openly, to remember without shame, to acknowledge that love didn't end just because life did. "It's going to change this town," he said. "I know. Might tear it apart before it brings it together. I know that too." He picked up his hammer, water still dripping from its handle. "Then we'd better build it strong enough to hold all that weight." They worked until sunset, the wood and metal slowly taking new shape under their hands. The broken wagon was beginning to transform, piece by piece, into something Ridge Hollow didn't know it needed, but would never be able to do without. As darkness fell, Eban walked Tilda back to the boarding house. They didn't speak much, but there was an understanding between them now. A partnership forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. At the boarding house steps, Tilda turned to him. "Thank you."
"For the hammer."
"For the work. For standing in the rain. That hammer's been in my family 3 generations, Eban said. My grandfather used it to build houses. My father used it to repair them. Seems fitting that I'd use it to build something that might repair people." She smiled, a small smile, but genuine. It was the first time Eban had seen her smile, and it changed her whole face, made her look younger, less weathered by sorrow. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "Tomorrow." He walked back to his smithy through streets grown quiet with evening. In his forge, he lit the fire and began working on the axle, his hammer ringing out through the darkness like a heartbeat, steady and strong and full of purpose. A week passed, then another. The wagon slowly took shape under Tilda and Eban's patient hands. The new axle fit perfectly, the metalwork was sound, and fresh lumber was replacing the broken boards piece by piece. But something else was happening too, something neither of them had anticipated. People were starting to ask questions. Mrs. Pemberton was the first to approach Tilda directly. She caught her at the general store, where Tilda was buying nails and wood stain. The older woman's face was pinched with something that might have been concern or might have been disapproval, hard to tell with Mrs. Pemberton. "Miss Rane," she began, her voice carefully neutral, "I feel it's my duty as a Christian woman to ask after your well-being. This project you've undertaken, forgive me for saying so, but it seems an odd choice. That wagon has an unfortunate history." "I know its history," Tilda replied calmly. "Then surely you understand why people are troubled. The Morrison tragedy was a terrible thing. Most of us prefer not to dwell on such sorrows. Most of you prefer to pretend they never happened." Mrs. Pemberton's face flushed. "That's hardly fair. We've done what we could for the Morrisons. The church sees to their needs, and the town avoids them like plague victims," Tilda said quietly. "When was the last time you visited them, Mrs. Pemberton? When was the last time anyone spoke the names of Tommy and Elizabeth Morrison out loud?" The older woman had no answer for that. She left the store in a huff, but Tilda could see the question had landed. That night, she heard Mrs. Pemberton had walked over to the Morrison house with a basket of food and sat with the mother for an hour. Just sat there in silence because the woman still couldn't speak. It was a start. Deputy Samuel was the next to approach, but his curiosity was gentler. He was young, maybe 25, with an honest face and the kind of earnestness that hadn't been worn away by life yet. He found Tilda and Eban working late one evening and dismounted from his horse with the careful respect of someone approaching something they didn't quite understand. "Miss Rane." "Mr. Croft," he said, hat in his hands. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Just taking a break anyway," Eban replied. "What brings you by, Samuel?" The young man looked at the wagon, then at them, then back at the wagon. "I've been watching you work, and I can't quite figure what you're building. It looks like a wagon, but it's not quite right for travel. The sides are too high, and you're adding those shelves inside and—" He paused. "I'm sorry. It's not my business." "You can ask," Tilda said. "I'm not keeping it secret. What is it then?" "A memorial. For children who've died in Ridge Hollow. A place where their families can remember them, where their names will be spoken, where their lives will be honored instead of forgotten." Samuel's face went very still. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the wagon with new understanding. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "My sister, Lucy, she died 6 years ago. Scarlet fever. She was 9 years old." He swallowed hard. "Nobody talks about her anymore. My parents, they can't even say her name without falling apart. So we just don't. We pretend like she never existed, and it's killing us all slowly. Then she'll be remembered here," Tilda said. "If your family wants that." "They'll want it," Samuel said with certainty. When should we? When it's ready." "Another few weeks, maybe. We're still gathering information, still learning who needs to be remembered." "How many?" Samuel asked. "How many children has Ridge Hollow lost?" Eban and Tilda exchanged glances. They'd been asking around quietly, piecing together information from old records at the church, from conversations with the doctor, from whispered memories people shared when they thought no one was paying attention. 9, Eban said finally. "In the last 3 years alone. 9 children." The number hung in the air like smoke. 9 families carrying grief in silence. 9 sets of parents waking up every morning to empty bedrooms and unanswered prayers. 9 children whose names were spoken only in private, if at all, because the town had decided that forgetting was easier than feeling. Samuel's hands clenched on his hat. 9, he repeated. "God above. I knew about some of them, but I didn't realize—" He looked at Tilda with new respect. "This is good work you're doing, Miss Rane. Important work. Will you help us gather names?" Tilda asked. "We want to be certain we haven't missed anyone, that every child is honored." "I'll start tomorrow," Samuel promised. "I'll check every record, Talk to families if they'll let me. Nobody's going to be forgotten. Not if I have anything to say about it." He left with purpose in his stride, and Tilda felt something shift inside her chest. The memorial was starting to matter to other people, was starting to become bigger than just her grief or Eban's loss. It was becoming something the whole town needed, whether they knew it yet or not, but not everyone was pleased. Mayor Thornton arrived 3 days later, accompanied by 2 members of the town council. He was a stocky man in his 50s, with a politician's smile and a businessman's eyes. He'd made his money in freight before settling in Ridge Hollow, and he ran the town with the same efficiency he'd run his wagons. No waste, no sentiment, everything in service of profit and progress. "Miss Rane," he said, tipping his hat with false courtesy. "Mr. Croft, might we have a word?" They set down their tools and waited. "The council has received several complaints about this project of yours," Thornton began. "Concerns about its appropriateness, its impact on town morale, its placement on what is, technically, public property." "I bought this wagon legally," Tilda replied evenly. "And I'm working on it where Mercer allowed me to work. Be that as it may, the council feels that a memorial of this nature, particularly one focused on tragedy, sends the wrong message about Ridge Hollow. We're trying to attract new families, new businesses. We need to present an image of vitality and opportunity, not death and sorrow. Those 9 children died here," Eban said, his voice hard. "That's not an image. That's truth. And truth, Mr. Croft, can be presented in various ways. We have a cemetery for the dead. We have a church for mourning. We don't need a public monument to suffering sitting on our main street. What we need," Tilda said quietly, "is honesty. Those children lived here. They mattered. Their families are still here, still grieving, still needing a place where their loss is acknowledged. You want to pretend they never existed because it's inconvenient for business." Thornton's face darkened. "I resent that implication. I've contributed generously to several families who suffered losses. The town has been nothing but supportive." "The town has been silent," Tilda interrupted. "Silence and support aren't the same thing. Miss Rane, I'm going to be direct. The council would prefer if you discontinued this project. If you insist on continuing, we'll be forced to take legal action regarding its placement and its compliance with town ordinances." "Then I'll move it," Eban said suddenly. "To my property, behind the smithy. It's private land, and there's nothing you can do about that." Thornton looked between them, realizing he'd underestimated their resolve. "This is foolishness. Both of you are letting grief cloud your judgment. Nothing good can come from dwelling on the past. Nothing good comes from burying it either," Tilda replied. The mayor left with his council members, but the threat hung in the air. The town's power structure had taken notice, and they weren't pleased. Moving the wagon would mean more work, would mean delaying the memorial, but it would also mean claiming the project fully, making it theirs in a way that no one could challenge. That evening, as they hauled the wagon piece by piece to Eban's property, Tilda realized something had changed. This act of defiance had made a statement. They weren't asking permission anymore. They weren't apologizing for remembering. They were claiming space for grief in a world that wanted to push it aside. By the time they'd reassembled what they'd moved, it was nearly midnight. They stood in Eban's yard, exhausted but satisfied, looking at the wagon by moonlight. "You know this is going to divide the town," Eban said. "It already has. But maybe that's necessary. Maybe people need to take a side, need to decide whether they believe grief deserves a place, or whether it should stay hidden away in dark corners where it can't make anyone uncomfortable. What if most of them choose the second option?" Tilda smiled slightly. "Then most of them will be wrong, and we'll build this anyway. For the families who need it. For the children who deserve to be remembered. For ourselves. Because we've spent too long pretending we were fine when we were breaking apart inside." Eban nodded slowly, then reached out and took her hand. It was the first time they'd touched beyond the accidental brush of fingers passing tools, and the contact sent warmth through both of them. Not romance, not yet, but connection, understanding, the recognition that they weren't alone anymore. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For the hammer, For your property, for believing this matters. It does matter, Eban replied. Maybe it's the only thing that does. They stood there under the stars. Two broken people building something whole, and for the first time in years, both of them felt like they might actually survive their grief instead of just enduring it. The wagon stood in Eban's yard like a question waiting to be answered. Word of its relocation spread through Ridge Hollow faster than wildfire through dry grass, and with it came a shift in the town's attention. What had been mockery and confusion was transforming into something more complex. Curiosity mixed with unease, interest tangled with resistance. Eban began carving the crosses 2 weeks after they'd moved the wagon. He worked in the evenings after the day's smithing was done, choosing pine because it was soft enough to carve, but strong enough to last. Each cross was different, sized to match the age of the child, carved with small details that made it unique. A flower for Elizabeth Morrison, who'd loved picking wildflowers. A book for Lucy, Samuel's sister, who'd been teaching herself to read before the fever took her, and Tilda watched him work with quiet admiration. His hands, so accustomed to brutal force and scorching metal, moved with surprising delicacy across the wood. He didn't talk much while he carved, but she could see the care in every cut, the reverence in every stroke. "You're good at this," she said one evening. "My father taught me. Said a blacksmith should know his way around wood as well as iron, that understanding one helped you understand the other." He paused, studying the cross in his hands. "Never thought I'd be using the skill for this. Would he approve?" Eban considered the question. "My father buried 3 children before they saw their 2nd birthdays. This was back east before we came west. He never talked about them, but I found their names in the family Bible after he died. I used to wonder why he never mentioned them, why he let them slip away like they'd never been born." He set down the cross carefully. By the end of the week, all 9 crosses were complete. Eban arranged them in a row on his workbench, and Tilda came to paint the names. She'd bought proper paint from the general store, black, because it would last and because grief deserved permanence, not something that would fade with the first hard rain. She painted each letter with the precision of someone who understood that these names were sacred trust. Tommy Morrison, Elizabeth Morrison, Lucy. The others, children whose stories were being gathered one by one as Deputy Samuel made good on his promise to record every loss. There was Henry, who drowned in the creek during spring flood 2 years back. Margaret, who'd been stillborn and whom her mother had never been allowed to properly mourn, because she never drew breath. So what was there to grieve? Thomas, who'd been kicked by a horse. Anna, who'd simply stopped breathing one night for no reason anyone could explain. Each name felt like a weight being lifted and a burden being accepted simultaneously. These children had existed. They had mattered. And now their names would be spoken again, would be seen again, would be remembered. As words spread about the crosses, something unexpected began to happen. Families started coming to the smithy, not to protest, but to contribute. The first was Tommy Morrison's mother. She came alone on a Thursday morning while her husband was resting. She couldn't walk well anymore. The accident had damaged more than just her spirit, but she made the journey anyway, leaning heavily on a cane. Tilda saw her approaching and went to meet her, offering an arm for support. The woman took it without a word, her eyes fixed on the wagon. When they reached it, she stood there for a long time, just looking. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small photograph in a tin frame. It showed 2 children, a boy and a girl, sitting stiffly for the camera, but with hints of smiles at the corners of their mouths. "For the wagon," she said quietly. Her voice was rough from disuse, each word clearly an effort. "So people remember what they looked like. Not just that they died, but that they lived." Tilda took the photograph with trembling hands. "We'll honor it. We'll keep it safe, thank you." The woman's eyes were wet. "Nobody talks about them. Nobody says their names." I started to feel like I'd imagined them, like they'd never been real. But they were real. They were mine. They were real, Tilda agreed. "And they'll be remembered." After the woman left, Tilda sat with the photograph for a long time. 2 children who'd been loved and lost, and a mother who'd been carrying that loss alone because no one knew how to sit with her grief. This was why the memorial mattered, not just as a monument to the dead, but as permission for the living to acknowledge what they'd lost. Other families followed. Some came during the day, others at twilight when fewer people might see them. They brought photographs, small toys, locks of hair tied with ribbon, letters written but never sent. Each offering came with a story, and Tilda and Eban listened to every one. They learned about Margaret, whose mother had been told she was being dramatic for grieving a baby who'd never lived. The mother brought a tiny knitted cap she'd made, explained how she'd held her daughter's body and known with absolute certainty that this was her child, that the lack of breath didn't erase existence. They learned about Anna, whose parents had been told it's God's will so many times they'd started to resent God himself. Her father brought a wooden puzzle he'd carved for her 3rd birthday, explained how she'd been working on it when she went to sleep that fatal night. Each story added weight to the memorial's purpose. This wasn't just about death, it was about love that continued past death, about the refusal to let absence erase presence, about the fundamental human need to say they mattered and have someone hear it, but the resistance intensified too. More council members came by, making veiled threats about property values and town reputation. Mrs. Pemberton, despite her earlier moment of clarity, started spreading rumors again. This time, that Tilda was practicing some kind of mountain witchcraft, that the memorial was inviting dark spirits into town. Some families who'd initially shown interest pulled back, frightened by the social pressure. The town was dividing itself clearly now. Those who believed grief deserved acknowledgement and those who thought it should remain private. Buried, dealt with in silence. Mayor Thornton made another appearance. This time with a written ordinance he claimed the council had passed regarding public displays of mourning. Eban read it, handed it back, and said simply, "This is private property, and you have no authority here." The mayor left angry. But he left through it all. The wagon continued to transform. The crosses were mounted along its sides, visible from the road. The photographs and mementos were carefully arranged inside, protected from weather but visible to anyone who approached. Flowers were planted around the base, wild flowers, because they grew without fuss and came back every year without needing tending. It was becoming beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with decoration and everything to do with love. Every element told a story, every detail honored a life. And slowly, carefully, it was beginning to change how Ridge Hollow thought about grief. One evening, as they worked in comfortable silence, Eban spoke without looking up from the bracket he was adjusting. "I've been thinking about my son." Tilda waited, letting him find his words. "I never named him. Anne and I had talked about names, but we hadn't decided. And after they both died, it seemed, I don't know, like naming him would make it hurt more somehow." He paused. "But that was wrong. He existed. He deserves a name. What would you like to call him?" "James, after his grandfather." "James Croft. Then James Croft will be remembered here," Tilda said. "With all the others?" Eban nodded, something loosening in his chest. He'd carried that unnamed grief for 12 years, and speaking it aloud felt like setting down a burden he hadn't realized was crushing him. That night, Tilda carved a 10th cross. She painted it the next morning, and Eban mounted it with the others. James Croft, who'd lived only minutes but who'd been loved for 12 years of silence, finally had a place where his father could say his name aloud. The memorial was growing, and so were the people building it. The transformation of Ridge Hollow happened slowly, then all at once. For 3 weeks after the crosses were mounted, the town maintained its uneasy division. Then Jacob Morrison came to the smithy, and everything changed. He arrived on a Saturday morning, driving a wagon that moved with the careful slowness of someone who knew their body couldn't take much jarring. His back had never healed right after the accident, and he walked with a pronounced limp, each step clearly painful. But he made the journey anyway, because some things mattered more than comfort. Tilda was working on the wagon's interior shelving when she heard the wagon approach. She looked up to see Jacob climbing down with visible effort, and something in her chest tightened. She'd heard about him from Deputy Samuel, how he'd become a shadow of himself after losing his children, how he sat for hours in his house staring at nothing, how he'd stopped attending church because he couldn't stand the well-meaning platitudes anymore. "Mr. Morrison," she said, setting down her tools. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the memorial wagon with the slow inevitability of a man approaching something he'd been avoiding for too long. When he reached it, he placed one weathered hand on the side rail, right next to where Tommy's cross was mounted. His shoulders began to shake. Tilda and Eban stood back, giving him space for grief that had been dammed up too long. Jacob Morrison wept like a man who'd forgotten how. The sounds torn from him rough and painful, years of held-back sorrow finally finding release. When he could speak again, his voice was raw. "I couldn't look at it before. Couldn't stand to think about that wagon, about what it took from me. When they pulled it up from that ravine, I wanted them to burn it, wanted to erase every trace of the thing that killed my babies." "I understand," Tilda said quietly, "but you didn't erase it. He looked at the crosses, at the careful carpentry, at the flowers growing around the base. "You made it into something that honors them. You gave them back to me, gave me permission to remember them as more than just how they died." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a silver locket on a thin chain. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing a photograph inside. The same two children from the larger photograph his wife had brought. But in this one they were laughing, caught mid-motion, fully alive. "This was my wife's. She wore it every day until the accident. After, she couldn't bear to look at it. She gave it to me and asked me to bury it with them, but I couldn't. It felt like burying them twice." He held it out to Tilda. "I want it here. Want people to see them happy. Want them remembered as children who laughed, not just as a tragedy." Tilda took the locket with reverent hands. "We'll keep it safe. We'll honor their memory." Jacob nodded, tears still streaming down his weathered face. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled Tilda into an embrace, this broken man who'd lost everything holding on to another broken person who was trying to make meaning from loss. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me my children back." He left after that, but something fundamental had shifted. Jacob Morrison, the man who'd been held up as the ultimate example of why grief should stay private, why tragedy should be forgotten, had publicly embraced the memorial, had declared through his presence and his offering that remembering was better than forgetting, that honoring the dead mattered more than protecting the living from discomfort. News of his visit spread through Ridge Hollow like morning light breaking through clouds. By the next day, more families were coming forward. Not just the families of the 9 children whose names were already recorded, but others, families with older losses, with grief they'd been carrying for 5 years, 10 years, longer. A woman named Josephine arrived with fabric from her son's clothes. He'd died 8 years ago in a mining accident, and she'd kept his shirts folded in a trunk, unable to look at them, but unable to let them go. Now she wanted to contribute them to the memorial, wanted them made into something that would honor his memory and help other families feel less alone. Deputy Samuel brought information about his sister Lucy that transformed her from a name on a cross into a real person. He talked about how she'd loved stories, how she'd make him act out adventures with her, how she'd had a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. He brought her favorite hair ribbon, blue, worn soft with use, and asked if it could be displayed with her cross. Even some of the council members began to reconsider. Councilman Porter, a stern man who'd voted with Mayor Thornton on every ordinance, appeared at the smithy one evening. He stood at a distance for a long time before finally approaching. "My grandson," he said abruptly, "died 4 years ago, pneumonia. He was 6 years old, and we never... He stopped, struggling with words. "His name was William. I'd like him remembered here, if that's acceptable." "Of course," Tilda replied. "Tell us about him." And Porter did. Standing in Eban's yard as the sun set, this man who'd built his reputation on hardness and pragmatism talked about a boy who'd loved to help him in his woodshop, who'd asked endless questions about how things worked, who'd called him Poppy and made him feel like the most important person in the world. By the time he finished, he was crying, another dam breaking, another permission granted to feel what had been suppressed too long. Eban carved an 11th cross that night, and Porter brought a small wooden boat the next day, something he'd made with William, something that represented time spent together rather than time lost. Mrs. Pemberton had her true change of heart around then. She came to the smithy not with gossip but with confession. She had a grandson, she admitted, her daughter's son, born too early and lived only 3 days. Her daughter had left Ridge Hollow after, unable to bear the town's silence, and Mrs. Pemberton hadn't seen her in 6 years. The baby's name had been Patrick, and no one in town except her daughter and son-in-law had known he existed. I told myself it was better not to speak of it, Mrs. Pemberton said, her usual sharp manner softened by grief, that bringing it up would only cause more pain. But the pain was there anyway, wasn't it? And the silence just made it grow in the dark like something poisonous. She'd written to her daughter, she said, told her about the memorial, about Tilda and Eban's work, about how Ridge Hollow was learning to speak the names of its lost children. Her daughter had written back, the first letter in 3 years, and was planning to visit for the dedication ceremony. "You're giving me my daughter back," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice breaking. "Just like you gave Jacob Morrison his children back. Not literally, but the memory of them, the right to love them openly. That's a gift I can't repay." "You don't have to," Tilda said. "Just help other families find their way here. Help them know it's safe to remember." Mrs. Pemberton nodded and became one of the memorial's strongest advocates after that, using her considerable influence to counter Mayor Thornton's resistance. Through it all, Tilda and Eban's relationship deepened. They worked side by side every day, their movements synchronized, their understanding of each other growing without need for many words. In the evenings, they'd sit on Eban's porch and talk about the families who'd visited, the stories they'd heard, the weight and the privilege of holding other people's grief. One such evening, as stars began appearing overhead, Eban reached over and took Tilda's hand. They'd held hands before, brief touches, moments of comfort, but this was different. This was intentional, sustained, a statement of something growing between them. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he said quietly. "Not just the work, but this connection, the sense that tomorrow might hold something worth waking up for." "Neither did I," Tilda admitted. "I thought grief would be all I'd ever feel, that I'd spend the rest of my life just surviving it. And now..." She looked at the memorial wagon, at the crosses gleaming in the twilight, at the flowers that had taken root around its base. "Now I think maybe grief and joy can exist together. That remembering the dead doesn't mean we can't also live. That love doesn't end. It just changes form." Eban squeezed her hand gently. Neither of them was ready to name what was developing between them, but they didn't need to. Some things grew better in patient silence, tended carefully, given time to root deep before blooming. The memorial was nearly complete. The wagon had been transformed from a vessel of death into a garden of memory. 10 crosses stood along its sides, soon to be 12, with William and Patrick added. Photographs and mementos filled the shelves inside. Flowers bloomed around its base, and slowly, carefully, Ridge Hollow was learning that broken things could be beautiful, that grief could be spoken aloud, and that remembering together was infinitely better than forgetting alone. But the memorial's greatest transformation and the town's greatest challenge was still to come. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning when Tilda was doing final work on the wagon's interior structure. She'd been reinforcing the bed where it had been weakened by years of weather and neglect, carefully removing the last sections of damaged wood to replace them with fresh lumber. That's when she noticed it, a slight irregularity in the wagon bed's construction, a seam that didn't quite match the others. She ran her fingers along it, feeling for what her eyes were telling her was there. A hidden compartment, so well concealed that 3 years of exposure and 2 months of reconstruction hadn't revealed it. She worked carefully to open it, not wanting to damage whatever might be inside. The wood was swollen from water damage, making it difficult, but eventually she managed to pry up the false bottom panel. Inside was a leather-bound journal, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from the worst of the weather. The leather was still damp, the pages yellowed and brittle, but the writing remained legible. Tilda lifted it out with trembling hands, recognizing immediately that she was holding something significant. She opened to the first page. This journal belongs to Catherine Hayes, begun on the journey west, March 1882. Tilda's breath caught. 1882, 5 years before the Morrison tragedy. This wagon's story ran deeper than anyone had known. She sat down right there in the wagon bed and began to read. Catherine's entries were sparse at first, brief notes about travel conditions, about the landscape passing by, about the hope and fear that came with heading into unknown territory. She'd been traveling alone, which was unusual enough to merit mention. Her husband had died in a factory accident back east, and she was heading to Oregon, where her brother had established a homestead. But halfway through the journal, the tone changed. I am with child. I discovered this 2 weeks ago and have been uncertain how to feel. Part of me rejoices. Thomas left me this final gift, this piece of him that will continue. But part of me fears. I'm alone on this trail, and childbirth is dangerous even with help nearby. What if something goes wrong? Tilda's hands tightened on the journal. She knew, before reading further, how this story ended. Knew it with the certainty of someone who understood that this wagon had been collecting tragedy long before Ridge Hollow had known it existed. The entries continued. Catherine wrote about feeling the baby move, about talking to the child growing inside her, about the plans she was making. She'd already decided on a name, Sarah if it was a girl, Thomas if it was a boy, but then the entries became more desperate. The pains have started, but I'm still 3 days from the nearest settlement. I'm alone. God help me, I am so alone. The next entry was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. The baby came today. A girl, Sarah, she is perfect and beautiful, and she will not breathe. I have tried everything I know. She simply will not breathe. I am holding her, and I cannot. The entry ended there. The ink, smeared as if water or tears had fallen on the page. There was one final entry dated 2 days later, written in a different hand, masculine, firm. The writing of someone who'd been taught proper penmanship, found this wagon abandoned off the trail. Inside, a woman and infant, both deceased. From the journal, her name was Catherine Hayes, heading to Oregon. The child appears to have been stillborn. The woman died shortly after, likely from complications of childbirth. We buried them both beside the trail, marked with stones. The wagon and its contents we brought to Ridge Hollow for disposition. May God have mercy on their souls. Marcus Reed, Trail Guide. Tilda sat there for a long time, the journal open in her lap, tears streaming down her face. This wagon hadn't just carried the Morrison children to their deaths. It had been a deathbed for Catherine Hayes and her daughter Sarah 5 years before that. 2 separate tragedies, both buried, one literally. And in the town's collective forgetfulness, she thought about Catherine's final days, alone on the trail, giving birth in this wagon without help, watching her daughter fail to breathe, knowing she herself was dying and there was no one to call to, no one to pray with, no one to witness that these lives had mattered. Then she thought about the Morrison family. They'd purchased this wagon third hand, probably never knowing its history, had ridden in it, laughed in it, made plans in it, all while traveling in what was essentially a tomb no one had marked. The weight of it was staggering. Eban found her an hour later, still sitting in the wagon bed, the journal clutched in her hands. He climbed up beside her without speaking, waiting for her to find words. "It's cursed," she said finally. "This wagon. I thought we were transforming one tragedy, but it's been carrying death for years. Catherine Hayes and her baby died in this wagon in 1882. No one in Ridge Hollow even knew. The Morrisons never knew what they'd bought. She handed him the journal, and he read through it with growing horror and sadness. When he finished, he set it down carefully and looked at the wagon's wooden frame with new understanding. "How many other tragedies?" he said quietly. "How many other deaths and sorrows did this wagon witness that we'll never know about? How much pain has it carried that no one thought to honor or acknowledge?" "Maybe we shouldn't build this memorial," Tilda said, her earlier certainty crumbling. "Maybe some things really are cursed. Maybe we're just inviting more sorrow by trying to—" "No," Eban's voice was firm. "No, this makes it more important, not less." "How can you say that?" "Because Catherine Hayes deserves to be remembered just as much as Tommy Morrison does. Because Sarah, who never drew a breath but was still loved, deserves a place where her mother's love for her is acknowledged. Because this wagon has been carrying untold grief for at least a decade, maybe longer, and the only curse here is the silence that let that grief go unwitnessed." He took Tilda's hands in his, making her look at him. "You dreamed last winter about Lily, didn't you? About what she might want for you, what she might say if she could speak." Tilda nodded, not trusting her voice. "What if Catherine and Sarah and all the others, what if they're speaking too? Not asking for vengeance or warning us away, but asking for what every soul deserves. To be remembered, to have their existence acknowledged, to matter. But what if we can't? What if there are so many we don't even know about?" "Then we remember the ones we can," Eban said simply. "We honor Catherine and Sarah alongside Tommy and Elizabeth and Lucy and all the others. We expand the memorial to include not just Ridge Hollow's children, but all the forgotten souls who passed through here. We make this wagon into what it should have been all along, a witness to lives lived, no matter how briefly." Tilda closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words settling over her like a blanket. The memorial wasn't just about Ridge Hollow anymore. It wasn't even just about children, though they would always be its heart. It was about the fundamental human need to say, "I was here. I mattered. My grief and my love and my life counted for something." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Catherine, alone on the trail, holding her daughter and knowing no one would remember them. Kept thinking about how close she herself had come to the same fate, dying alone in the high country, her grief unwitnessed, her life fading into obscurity. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and walked to the wagon in the moonlight. She placed her hand on its side, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her palm, and whispered to all the ghosts it carried, "I see you. We see you. You'll be remembered now. I promise." The wind stirred the wildflowers growing around the base, and for a moment Tilda could have sworn she felt something, not frightening but peaceful, like a long-held breath finally being released, like a burden being set down after years of carrying it. She stood there until dawn, keeping vigil with the wagon and its ghosts, and when morning came, she knew with absolute certainty what needed to be done. Eban found her there when he came out to start the day's work. She was sitting on the ground beside the wagon, Catherine's journal open in her lap, writing something on a piece of paper. "What are you doing?" he asked gently, expanding the memorial. "Catherine Hayes and her daughter Sarah will be the first names we add beyond Ridge Hollow's known children. They deserve to be remembered just as much as anyone else." She looked up at him. "And we need to let people know that this memorial isn't just for our town anymore. It's for everyone. Anyone who's lost someone and never had a place to grieve. Anyone whose loved ones were forgotten because their deaths were inconvenient or uncomfortable, or just too far away from witnesses. That's going to change everything," Eban said. "The scope, the meaning, the purpose. I know. But it's right. Catherine's journal, it's like she left it there for us to find. Like she was waiting all these years for someone to tell her story, to say her daughter's name, to acknowledge that their lives mattered, even though no one witnessed their ending." Eban knelt beside her, looking at what she'd written. 2 new names to be carved, Catherine Hayes and Sarah Hayes, mother and daughter, separated from their intended destination, but finally finding a resting place in memory, if not in body. "There might be others," Tilda continued. "Other hidden tragedies connected to this wagon or this place. We should ask people to share any stories they know, not just about children, not just about recent losses. but about anyone whose grief hasn't found a home. The dedication ceremony, Eban said, understanding dawning. We'll need to change what we'd planned. Make it about more than just the 12 children we know. Make it about opening a door for all grief, all remembrance. Will people accept that? Will they understand? Some will immediately. Others will need time. But Catherine's story, if we share it, if we let people read her words, I think it'll help them see why this matters. Why remembering isn't morbid or cursed, but necessary and healing. That afternoon, they called a meeting at the smithy. Deputy Samuel spread the word, and by evening, nearly 30 people had gathered, families who'd already contributed to the memorial. Town council members, curious townspeople who'd been watching from a distance. Tilda stood before them, Catherine's journal in her hands, and told the story. She read passages aloud, Catherine's hopes, her fears, her love for the child growing inside her, her final desperate entries. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. This wagon has been carrying tragedy for at least a decade, Tilda said. Probably longer. We'll never know all the stories it holds, all the grief it's witnessed. But we can honor what we do know. We can make sure Catherine Hayes and her daughter Sarah are remembered alongside our own children. We can open this memorial to anyone whose loss has gone unacknowledged. There was silence for a moment. Then Jacob Morrison spoke up. My children weren't the first to die in that wagon. I always believed they were, and that somehow made it worse. Made it feel like the wagon was cursed, like we'd been singled out for tragedy. His voice broke. But knowing about Catherine and Sarah, it doesn't make losing Tommy and Elizabeth hurt less, but it makes their deaths part of something larger. Makes it less about being cursed and more about life being hard and precious and brief. My grandson William, Councilman Porter added, he's buried in the town cemetery, and we visit his grave. But Catherine and Sarah don't have that. Their graves are somewhere on the trail, unmarked, forgotten. This memorial gives them what they should have had from the beginning. Mrs. Pemberton stood up, her usual stern demeanor softened by emotion. I've been thinking about all the people I've known who died alone or far from home. My own mother died while I was traveling here, and I never got to say goodbye. She's buried in Missouri, and I'll probably never see her grave again. This memorial, it could be for her too, couldn't it? For everyone we carry in our hearts but can't visit? Yes, Tilda said. That's exactly what it's for. The meeting continued late into the night, with person after person sharing stories of lost loved ones. Not just children, but parents, siblings, spouses, friends. People who died far from home, or whose graves had been lost to time, or who'd been forgotten because their survivors had moved on and no one else remembered. By the time people began drifting home, the memorial's purpose had transformed. It was no longer just about Ridge Hollow's children, though they would always be at its heart. It was about giving grief a place to exist openly, about honoring all the forgotten dead, about saying that every life mattered, regardless of how or where or when it ended. Mayor Thornton, who'd been standing at the back of the crowd throughout the meeting, approached Tilda as people were leaving. I was wrong, he said simply. I thought you were dwelling on tragedy, inviting pain that we'd moved past. But we hadn't moved past anything. We'd just buried it and hoped it would decay into nothing. It doesn't work that way. No, Tilda agreed. It doesn't. I have a daughter, Thornton said quietly. Died 10 years ago before I became mayor. She was 12. Her name was Caroline. I've never spoken about her publicly because I thought showing that kind of pain would make me seem weak. Unsuitable for leadership. Will you let us honor her here? Thornton nodded, his composure finally cracking. Please, I'd like that very much. As he walked away, Eban came to stand beside Tilda. They watched the crowd disperse, carrying news of the memorial's expanded purpose throughout Ridge Hollow. We've started something big, Eban said. Bigger than either of us probably understands yet. Are you frightened? Terrified, he admitted. But also more alive than I've felt in 12 years. Purpose does that, I think. Gives you something to be scared about that's worth the fear. Tilda leaned against him slightly, and he put his arm around her shoulders. Two people who'd been alone so long, finding comfort in shared purpose and growing affection. The wagon stood before them in the moonlight, no longer cursed but consecrated, transformed by intention and love, from a vessel of death into a sanctuary for memory. Catherine Hayes and Sarah Hayes would be remembered. Tommy and Elizabeth Morrison would be remembered. All the children, all the lost souls, all the grief that had nowhere else to go, it would all find a home here. And in the process of building that home, Tilda and Eban were building something else too, a future neither of them had believed possible. Rooted in shared sorrow, but reaching toward shared joy. The dedication ceremony was set for 3 weeks out, which gave Ridge Hollow time to prepare, and gave Tilda and Eban time to complete the memorial properly. But those 3 weeks transformed from simple preparation into something far more profound, a period of collective reckoning. As the town confronted grief it had spent years avoiding, the circuit preacher arrived in the 2nd week, a month earlier than his usual schedule. Word of the memorial had reached him in the next county over, and he'd changed his route specifically to see it and offer his blessing. His name was Reverend Marcus Stowe, and he was the kind of preacher who believed faith should comfort the afflicted rather than afflict the comfortable. He spent an afternoon examining the memorial, reading the names, studying the photographs and mementos. When Tilda showed him Catherine's journal, he sat down heavily on a bench and wept. "I've been riding this circuit for 15 years, he said when he could speak again. "Do you know how many graves I've blessed in unmarked places? How many people I've buried where there was no one to witness, no one to remember? I always said prayers for them, always hoped someone somewhere knew they'd existed. But hoping isn't the same as knowing." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bell. Not large, but solid, cast from bronze that had been polished until it gleamed. "This was made from mining tools," he explained. "Tools that were used up, that had served their purpose. A smith in Montana cast it for me 5 years ago, said every preacher needed a bell to call people to gathering. I've been carrying it ever since, waiting to understand what gathering it was meant for." He held it out to Tilda. "I think it was meant for this." The bell became the centerpiece of the dedication plans. It would ring for each name spoken, not as a funeral toll, but as a call to witness. A reminder that these lives had existed, that they mattered, that remembering them was both a duty and an honor. As word of the ceremony spread, the nature of the memorial's impact began revealing itself in unexpected ways. Deputy Samuel's mother, who hadn't left her house in the 6 years since Lucy died, started venturing out again. She came to the smithy one afternoon and stood before her daughter's cross for nearly an hour. Just stood there touching the wood and whispering. When she finally spoke to Tilda, her voice was rusty from disuse in public settings. "I thought if I talked about her I'd fall apart and never be able to put myself back together. So I just stopped. Stopped talking, stopped going out, stopped living, really. But standing here, seeing her name, knowing other people will say it and remember her, it doesn't hurt less, but it hurts differently. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Tilda replied. "I'm going to come to the ceremony. And I'm going to speak about her. Tell people what she was like, not just that she died. Is that allowed?" "It's exactly what should happen." Other families began making similar decisions. The memorial wasn't just about passive remembrance anymore. It was becoming an invitation to active testimony, to sharing the full lives of the lost, rather than just acknowledging their deaths. But the preparations weren't without conflict. Mayor Thornton's confession had split the town council. Some members followed his lead, admitting their own losses and supporting the memorial wholeheartedly. Others doubled down on resistance, arguing that the ceremony would damage Ridge Hollow's reputation and drive away potential settlers. A particularly heated town meeting took place 2 weeks before the ceremony. Councilman Morrison, no relation to Jacob, stood up and declared the whole thing an embarrassment to progress. "We're trying to build a future here," he argued. "How does dwelling on dead children help attract new families? How does advertising our tragedies make anyone want to settle here?" Jacob Morrison, the father, not the councilman, rose slowly to his feet, his damaged back making the movement painful, but his dignity making it powerful. My children aren't embarrassments, he said quietly. Their deaths were tragedies, yes, but their lives were blessings. And any family considering Ridge Hollow should know that we're the kind of town that remembers its dead, that honors its losses, that doesn't pretend pain doesn't exist just because it's inconvenient. Here, several voices called out. Furthermore, Jacob continued, I'd rather live in a town that acknowledges sorrow than one that pretends to be perfect. Grief is part of life. Death is part of life. A town that can't face, that honestly isn't a town I'd want my children growing up in, if I still had children to raise. The meeting ended without resolution, but the tide had clearly turned. More people supported the memorial than opposed it, and even some of the opposition was softening as they saw the healing it was bringing to their neighbors. Eban and Tilda worked long hours those final weeks, completing every detail with painstaking care. 14 crosses now stood along the wagon sides, 12 children from Ridge Hollow. Catherine Hayes and Sarah Hayes. Each cross was unique. Each told a story. Each represented a life that mattered. The interior shelving held photographs, letters, small treasures. A doll that had belonged to Elizabeth Morrison. The blue ribbon from Lucy, a book of poetry that had been Caroline Thornton's favorite. Each item placed with reverence, each representing love that continued past death. The flowers around the base had thrived, creating a living border that would bloom every spring, a reminder that even in the presence of death, life persisted. Tilda had chosen carefully columbines and Indian paintbrush, hardy mountain flowers that required little care but returned faithfully year after year. A stone base was constructed to hold the memorial bell, positioned near the wagon where it could be seen and heard from the road. Reverend Stowe blessed it one evening at sunset, his prayer simple but profound. May this bell call us to witness, to remember, and to honor. May it remind us that every life matters, every grief deserves acknowledgement, and every act of remembrance is an act of love. As the ceremony date approached, Tilda found herself wrestling with unexpected emotions. The memorial was nearly complete, which meant her purpose, the thing that had pulled her out of isolation and given her reason to continue, was reaching its culmination. What would come after? Would she retreat back to the mountains, back to solitude? Or had she changed enough that a different future was possible? Eban seemed to be grappling with similar questions. They'd grown close during the months of work, their relationship deepening from partnership into something neither of them had quite named. They worked well together, understood each other's silences, found comfort in each other's presence. But what happened when the work was done? One evening, 5 days before the ceremony, they sat on Eban's porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The memorial wagon stood in the yard before them, nearly complete. Beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional aesthetics and everything to do with purpose and love. I've been thinking about what comes next, Eban said quietly. Tilda's heart clenched. Uncertain what he meant. The memorial will need maintenance, he continued. Someone to tend the flowers, to care for the structure, to welcome families who come to visit. It's not the kind of thing that can be built and then forgotten. No. Tilda agreed. It'll need ongoing attention. I was thinking... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I was thinking that maybe you shouldn't go back up to the mountains. That maybe Ridge Hollow could be your home again, if you wanted it to be. I don't have a home here anymore. The ranch was sold years ago. You could build a new one. Or, he took a breath, you could share mine. Not immediately, not in any way that would compromise your reputation or make you uncomfortable. But eventually, if you wanted... Tilda turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his face, the hope he was trying to temper with caution. This man who'd helped her transform grief into grace, who'd stood beside her when the town mocked them, who'd carved crosses with the same care he'd once used to imagine building a cradle for his lost son. Are you asking me to marry you? Eban Croft. Not yet, he said honestly. We've both been alone so long, I think we need time to be sure. But I'm asking if you'd consider a future where you didn't have to be alone anymore, where we could tend this memorial together, live our lives together, Maybe find something that looks like happiness alongside the grief we'll always carry. Tilda felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Not sad tears, but the kind that came when something broken inside finally began to mend. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." He took her hand, and they sat there as darkness fell. Two people who'd survived impossible grief, finding their way toward possible joy. The next few days were a whirlwind of final preparations. A platform was built for speakers to address the crowd. Benches were arranged in a semicircle around the memorial. The town's women organized food for after the ceremony, not a funeral meal, but a celebration of life. A gathering where stories could be shared and connections strengthened. Deputy Samuel took responsibility for organizing the actual ceremony, creating a schedule that would allow time for each family to speak if they wanted, for Reverend Stowe to offer prayers, for the bell to ring for each name. He worked with quiet efficiency, his own grief over Lucy channeled into making sure every detail honored the dead appropriately. Mrs. Pemberton, transformed from gossip to guardian, coordinated with families to ensure everyone who wanted to participate knew when and how. Her daughter arrived from Denver 3 days before the ceremony, and their reunion, tearful, heartfelt, healing, reminded everyone why the memorial mattered. Even Mayor Thornton contributed, using his influence to ensure the ceremony would be well attended and properly respected. His own speech about Caroline was written and rewritten, each version bringing him closer to honesty about his own grief and his own failures to honor his daughter's memory properly. The night before the ceremony, Tilda couldn't sleep. She went out to the memorial in the darkness, lantern in hand, and did a final inspection. Everything was ready. The crosses were straight, the photographs secure, the flowers thriving. The bell hung ready to call the town to witness. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from isolated grief in the high country to this moment of communal remembrance. Thought about Catherine Hayes, whose hidden journal had expanded the memorial's purpose beyond what Tilda had originally imagined. Thought about all the families who'd found courage to speak their losses aloud, to remember openly, to grieve together. Tomorrow, she whispered to the wagon, to the ghosts it carried, to the future it represented. Tomorrow, we honor you all. The lantern light cast shadows across the crosses, making them seem to move slightly in the night breeze. 14 names, 14 lives, 14 reasons why remembering mattered more than forgetting ever could. Ridge Hollow slept that night, with anticipation and anxiety, with hope and hesitation. Tomorrow would change them. Tomorrow would challenge them. Tomorrow would teach them that broken things, broken wagons, broken hearts, broken people could be transformed into something beautiful if tended with enough patience, enough love, and enough courage to remember. The morning of the dedication ceremony dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that made promises about renewal. By mid-morning, people were gathering at Eban's property, coming from all corners of Ridge Hollow and beyond. Word had spread to neighboring settlements, and families who'd heard about the memorial made the journey to witness something they'd never seen before, a community choosing to remember rather than forget. Tilda stood near the memorial wagon, watching people arrive. She wore her best dress, the one she'd packed away 5 years ago and hadn't touched since. It still fit, though it hung a bit looser now. Eban stood beside her in his Sunday clothes, his usually work-roughened hands scrubbed clean, his grey hair combed back neatly. The benches filled quickly, but many people stood, not wanting to miss the ceremony even if they couldn't sit. Tilda counted at least 100 people, more than she'd imagined, more than she'd dared hope for. Every family who'd contributed to the memorial was there, along with curious townspeople, supporters, and even a few who'd opposed the project, but had come to see what all the attention was about. Mrs. Pemberton sat in the front row with her daughter beside her, both women holding hands, both already teary-eyed. Jacob Morrison sat with his wife, who'd made the painful journey from their house behind the church. It was the first time she'd been out in public since the accident, and several people gasped quietly when they saw her. She looked fragile but determined, her hand clutched tight in Jacob's. Deputy Samuel stood near the platform, his parents on either side of him. His mother looked nervous but resolute, ready to speak about Lucy for the first time in 6 years. Mayor Thornton sat with the council members who'd supported him, his speech about Caroline folded carefully in his coat pocket. At exactly noon, Reverend Stowe stepped onto the platform. The crowd quieted immediately, a hush falling over the gathering like a blessing. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "we are gathered here today to do something our hearts have needed for far too long. We are here to remember, to speak the names of those we've lost, to honor lives that mattered, no matter how brief, to acknowledge that grief is not weakness, that remembering is not dwelling, and that love continues even when life does not." He gestured toward the memorial wagon, with its 14 crosses gleaming in the sunlight. "What you see before you is more than wood and metal. It's a testament to the power of remembrance, to the courage of one woman who refused to let tragedy be the final word, and to a community learning that healing comes not from forgetting, but from acknowledging our losses honestly and together." He picked up the bronze bell, holding it aloft so everyone could see. "This bell will ring for each name we speak today, not as a funeral toll, but as a call to witness, as a declaration that these lives mattered, that they are remembered, and that they will not be forgotten as long as we choose to honor them." He paused, looking out over the assembled crowd. "We'll begin with the children of Ridge Hollow, then honor Catherine Hayes and her daughter Sarah, whose tragedy opened our eyes to how much grief we'd been carrying in silence. Each family will have the opportunity to speak about their loved one, not just about their death, but about their life, about who they were, what they loved, how they changed us." He set the bell on its stone base and struck it once. The sound rang out clear and pure, carrying across the valley like a prayer made audible. "Tommy Morrison," he announced. Jacob Morrison stood slowly, helping his wife to her feet. They walked together to the platform, and for a moment Jacob couldn't speak, overcome by the significance of this moment, the first time they'd been able to publicly honor their son's memory without shame or discomfort. Tommy was 7 years old. Jacob began, his voice shaking but steady. He loved horses, loved them so much he'd spend hours at the livery just watching them, learning their names, talking to them, like they understood every word. He smiled through his tears. He wanted to be a rancher when he grew up, wanted to have the biggest herd in Wyoming. He had dreams that stretched as wide as the sky. His wife squeezed his hand, and though she couldn't speak, her presence said everything that needed saying. Jacob continued, sharing stories about Tommy, his laughter, his stubbornness, his kindness to his little sister. When he finished, Reverend Stowe rang the bell again, and the sound seemed to carry Tommy's memory out into the world, making it real and honored and permanent. "Elizabeth Morrison," Reverend Stowe announced next. Jacob spoke about his daughter, too, about her love of wildflowers, about how she'd sing to herself while playing, about the way she'd follow her brother everywhere, trusting him completely. Another bell ring, another life honored, another step toward healing. One by one, the families came forward. Deputy Samuel's mother spoke about Lucy, her voice gaining strength as she shared memories of her daughter's love of stories, her imagination, her laughter that could brighten any room. The bell rang, and years of silence were broken. Caroline Thornton, William Porter, Margaret Henry, Thomas, Anna, Patrick, James Croft, each name spoken, each life honored, each bell ring a declaration that they had mattered, that they were loved, that they would not be forgotten. After the children of Ridge Hollow had been honored, Reverend Stowe paused, letting the weight of those 12 names settle over the crowd. Then he picked up Catherine's journal, handling it with the reverence it deserved. "Now we honor 2 souls who never made it to Ridge Hollow alive, but whose story has changed this town forever. Catherine Hayes and her daughter Sarah." Tilda stepped forward, her heart pounding. She'd prepared to speak about Catherine, feeling it was her responsibility since she'd discovered the journal. But standing before the assembled crowd, looking at all those faces, some tear-stained, some curious, all paying attention, she felt the full weight of what she was about to do. Catherine Hayes died alone. Tilda began, her voice clear despite her nerves. She died in this wagon in 1882, giving birth to a daughter who never drew breath. No one witnessed her passing. No one held her hand. No one prayed with her or told her she'd done well or promised to remember her child. She held up the journal so everyone could see. But she left us this, her words, her thoughts, her love for the child she carried. And in finding it, we learned something important, that this town, this territory, this whole frontier is full of stories like Catherine's, people who died alone, who were buried without ceremony, whose names faded from memory because there was no one to remember them. She opened the journal to one of Catherine's entries and read aloud, "I talk to Sarah every night. I tell her about her father, about the life we'll build in Oregon, about all the things I'll teach her. Even if something goes wrong, even if I don't survive this journey, I want her to know she was wanted. She was loved. She mattered." Tilda closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Sarah never knew those things. Never heard her mother's voice, never felt her touch, never knew how desperately she was loved. But we know now, and we can honor that love. We can say their names and make sure they're not forgotten. The bell rang twice, once for Catherine, once for Sarah. The sound seemed to echo longer this time, as if the universe itself was acknowledging these two souls who'd been lost in the wilderness of forgetting. Then something unexpected happened. A woman Tilda didn't recognize stood up from the back of the crowd. She was elderly, her face weathered by years of frontier life, her hands gnarled with arthritis. "My name is Virginia Reed," she said, her voice carrying despite her age. "I'm Marcus Reed's widow, the trail guide who found Catherine and buried her. We've been living in the next county over, but I heard about this memorial and had to come. Had to tell you that Marcus never forgot Catherine Hayes. He spoke about her often, wondered about her family, hoped someone somewhere knew she'd existed. He died 3 years ago, but if he were here, he'd want you to know that he did his best by her, that he said proper words over her grave and marked it with stones, that he grieved for a woman he never met because her death felt like a failure on his part, like he should have found her sooner, should have been able to save her somehow." She wiped her eyes. "Thank you for this, for giving Catherine and her baby the memorial they deserved, for proving that Marcus's prayers weren't in vain, that someone would remember, someone would care." The crowd sat in stunned silence, then began to applaud. It started quietly, almost uncertainly, then grew until it filled the valley, not celebration, but acknowledgement, witness, a collective declaration that these stories mattered, that these lives had weight, that remembering was both possible and necessary. Other people stood then, sharing their own stories of loss. A man whose brother had died in a mining accident and been buried in an unmarked grave. A woman whose infant daughter had been stillborn and whom she'd never been allowed to mourn properly because it happens all the time. You'll have others. An elderly couple whose son had gone west years ago and never returned, leaving them with questions that would never be answered, but grief that needed acknowledgement nonetheless. The ceremony stretched into the afternoon as story after story poured forth. Ridge Hollow was discovering that its grief ran deeper than anyone had realized, that pain unspoken had been festering in every family, waiting for permission to be acknowledged, and through it all, the bell rang. For the known and the unknown, for the named and the nameless, for every soul who'd passed through this place and left their mark in sorrow. Each ring was a promise. You will be remembered. You mattered. Your life counted for something, and your death is not the end of your story. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Reverend Stowe spoke final words of blessing over the memorial. He declared it consecrated ground, a sanctuary for memory, a place where grief would always be welcome and where love would be stronger than death. Then he invited everyone to come forward, to touch the wagon if they wanted, to read the names, to leave their own small offerings of remembrance. The crowd moved forward in waves, some quickly, some slowly, all with reverence. Tilda stood back and watched, overwhelmed by what had happened. What had started as one woman's attempt to honor her lost daughter had become something far larger, a community's reckoning with its own grief, a collective healing, a transformation of silence into witness. Eban came to stand beside her, taking her hand in his. No words were necessary. They'd done what they set out to do, and it was more than either of them had imagined possible. 3 months passed, and spring gave way to early summer. The memorial had become part of Ridge Hollow's landscape, as permanent and necessary as the church or the general store. People visited regularly, some daily, some weekly, but all with the understanding that this was a place where grief was honored rather than hidden. The wagon no longer looked broken. It had been transformed into something beautiful in the truest sense of the word, not decorative but purposeful. The crosses stood straight and proud, weathering the occasional rain, but standing firm. The flowers had spread, creating a natural border that required little maintenance, but returned faithfully. The photographs inside were protected but visible, and families had taken to leaving fresh flowers or small tokens beside the crosses of their loved ones. Tilda had indeed decided to stay in Ridge Hollow. She'd moved into Eban's house 2 months after the dedication ceremony, not as his wife yet, but as his companion, a mature courtship built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the slow rebuilding of hearts that had been broken too long. The town accepted it without scandal, understanding that these two people had earned their happiness through patience and pain. They'd become the unofficial guardians of the memorial, tending it together, welcoming visitors, listening to stories. Deputy Samuel helped too, checking on it during his rounds, making small repairs when needed, ensuring it remained a place of peace and reverence. The memorial had changed Ridge Hollow in ways both subtle and profound. Families no longer avoided each other when topics of loss came up. People spoke the names of the dead without whispering or apologizing. Children grew up knowing about siblings they'd never met, understanding that death was part of life, but that love continued past it. Mrs. Pemberton's daughter had moved back to town, reconciled with her mother through the shared grief they'd finally been able to acknowledge. She'd opened a small dress shop and was expecting a baby, new life growing in soil that had been enriched by facing old death honestly. Jacob Morrison had begun working again, his damaged back limiting what he could do, but his spirit renewed enough to try. His wife still couldn't speak, but she visited the memorial weekly, sitting on the bench beside Tommy and Elizabeth's crosses, and people said she seemed more peaceful than she'd been in years. Mayor Thornton had become the memorial's most vocal advocate, using his position to ensure it was maintained and respected. He spoke about Caroline openly now, and the town had learned that a leader who could acknowledge pain was stronger than one who pretended it didn't exist. On a warm June morning, Tilda and Eban stood together at the memorial, preparing for something new. Between them was a young apple tree, barely 3 feet tall, its leaves bright green and healthy. "You're sure this is the right place?" Eban asked. "I'm certain," Tilda replied. "Right here beside the wagon, where new life can grow, alongside the memory of those who've passed." They'd purchased the seedling from a traveling nurseryman, chosen specifically because apple trees lived for generations. This tree would outlast them both, would bear fruit long after they were gone, would stand as a living testament that grief and growth could coexist. They dug the hole together, working with the easy rhythm of two people who'd learned to move in harmony. When the hole was deep enough, they lowered the sapling carefully into the earth, spreading its roots gently, making sure it had room to grow. As they filled in the soil around it, Deputy Samuel arrived with his parents. Then Mrs. Pemberton came with her daughter. Jacob Morrison appeared with his wife. One by one, families who'd been part of the memorial's creation gathered, understanding without being told that this tree represented something important. When the planting was complete and the soil patted firm, Tilda stepped back and looked at what they'd created. The wagon with its crosses and memories, the flowers that bloomed faithfully, and now this tree which would grow and strengthen with each passing year. "My daughter loved apples," she said quietly, speaking to the assembled group. She'd eat them until her stomach hurt, then ask for more. I used to tell her that one day we'd have our own apple tree, and she could eat as many as she wanted. She placed her hand on the slender trunk. This tree is for Lily, but it's also for Tommy and Elizabeth, for Lucy and Caroline and William and all the others. It's for Catherine and Sarah. It's for everyone we've lost, and everyone we'll lose in the future. Because death doesn't stop just because we've learned to face it better. Eban moved to stand beside her, his arm around her waist. It's also for the living, he added. For the children who'll climb its branches someday. For the families who'll share its fruit. For the future we're building that honors the past without being imprisoned by it. Reverend Stowe, who'd become a frequent visitor to Ridge Hollow since the dedication, stepped forward. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the tree. Tilda nodded, and he placed both hands on the trunk, bowing his head in prayer. "Lord, bless this tree as you've blessed this memorial. Let it grow strong and bear much fruit. Let it stand as a reminder that from grief can come growth, from sorrow can come strength, from remembering can come renewal. Let its branches offer shade to the weary, and its fruit offer sustenance to the hungry. And let those who tend it remember that love is the only thing that outlasts death. The only force strong enough to transform tragedy into grace." "Amen," the gathered crowd murmured. As people began to drift away, returning to their daily lives, Tilda remained by the tree. She was remembering the winter she'd spent in the high country, the silence that had nearly swallowed her, the emptiness that had seemed permanent. She'd believed then that she was finished, that the rest of her life would be nothing more than waiting to die so she could be with Lily again. She'd been so wrong. The memorial hadn't brought Lily back, hadn't erased the pain of losing her, hadn't made grief disappear, but it had given that grief a home, a purpose, a way to exist that didn't destroy everything around it. And in building something for others, she'd rebuilt herself. Eban approached quietly, holding something in his hand. When he opened his palm, she saw a simple gold band. "I know we said we'd take our time," he said. "And we have 3 months of living together, learning each other, making sure this is what we both want. I think it is. I think you're the person I want to tend this memorial with, to grow old with. To build whatever time we have left into something that honors what we've lost and celebrates what we've found." Tilda's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, the kind that came with joy rather than sorrow. "Are you proposing to me next to a tree we just planted?" "I am. Because this tree represents everything we've built together, roots that go deep, growth that reaches upward, fruit that will nourish others. That's what I want our marriage to be." She held out her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to you. Yes to the memorial. Yes to whatever future we can build together." They stood there together as the afternoon sun filtered through the young tree's leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. The memorial wagon stood behind them, solid and permanent. The crosses gleamed in the sunlight. The flowers swayed in the gentle breeze, and the apple tree reached its small branches toward the sky, promising fruit in seasons to come. Ridge Hollow had learned what it meant to grieve honestly, to remember faithfully, to transform broken things into beautiful ones. The wagon that had carried so much death had become a monument to life and love. The woman they'd mocked for buying it had shown them that some purchases couldn't be measured in silver or cents, that sometimes you bought something broken because you recognized your own brokenness in it, and sometimes the only way to heal yourself was to heal something else first. As evening approached, Tilda and Eban walked back to the house they now shared, hands clasped, hearts lighter than they'd been in years. Behind them, the memorial stood in the gathering twilight, the bell silent but ready to ring again when grief needed acknowledgement, when love needed expression, when memory needed voice. The town had changed, the people had changed, and 2 souls who'd been lost in grief had found each other and found purpose, and found a way to live that honored the dead without forgetting to embrace the living. In the years that followed, the apple tree would grow tall and strong. Children would climb its branches, families would harvest its fruit, and lovers would sit beneath its shade. The memorial would welcome new names as tragedy inevitably returned, because death is part of life, and grief is the price of love. But Ridge Hollow would face those losses differently now, not with silence and shame, but with acknowledgement and community. And every spring, when the apple tree bloomed white and fragrant, people would remember the mountain woman who bought a broken wagon and the blacksmith who helped her fix it. They'd remember how two broken people had built something whole, how grief shared had been grief lessened, and how the simple act of remembering, of refusing to let love be erased by death, had transformed an entire town. The wagon would never roll again. It was never meant to. It had found its final purpose not in movement, but in stillness, not in carrying the living, but in honoring the dead, not in going somewhere, but in being exactly where it needed to be, a place where broken things came to be made whole, where grief came to be transformed into grace, and where love proved itself stronger than death by simply refusing to be forgotten.